afternoon. If we can all take a seat and be quiet. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Anja van der Vlies and I am co-chair of Protect Our Waterways. I'm so glad that we are able to gather today. It's wonderful to bring everyone together to do this important work. But before we start, I would like to make some acknowledgements. We are meeting on land that has been occupied by humans since the glaciers retreated over 10,000 years ago. I want to acknowledge those first people. We are meeting on the land that has been home to various nations over these thousands of years. I want to acknowledge the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Chinantau nations. These are the First Nations of this land. We are meeting on land covered by the Dish with One Spoon wampum, which states that anyone that takes up residence in the Great Lakes Basin, as we have, owes it to everyone else to share the resources and not deplete them. We are meeting on the land covered by Treaty Number 45.5, the Saugeen Treaty, signed in 1836. I acknowledge that our presence here is governed by this treaty and call upon our government to honor it. We are, as we are non-Indigenous, immigrants and settlers, as I am an immigrant. The true history of this land hasn't been taught in our schools, and we have much to learn about the true relations between the Indigenous people and Canadians. I acknowledge that I am on this learning journey and invite you to learn with me. The Indigenous people cared for this land and practiced sustainable living so as to not destroy the environment. We have much to learn from their teachings, and I wish to acknowledge what a deep privilege it is for us to gather here. As part of our reconciliation work, I wish for stronger ties to the Indigenous nations we live alongside today. I will now hand the meeting over to Mike Balkwell.
It's okay if you want to clap for Anja. Hi, my name is Mike Balkwell. I work for the Small Change Fund, and we're supporters of Protect Our Waterways, and I've been working with Protect Our Waterways on and off for the last 4 or 5 years. Very happy to be here and to be your host, a moderator for this very important meeting today. I'd just like to say a couple of things. Welcome on behalf of Protect Our Waterways. This is an information meeting. Protect Our Waterways is not the purpose of this meeting is to not tell you how to vote, but for sure, Protect Our Waterways thinks voting matters and hopes you will vote. I'd like to say a couple of things about the format of the agenda, and then we'll get right into it. I have to do a couple of housekeeping things first. You may know this already, but just to be sure, the washrooms are out that door and around that corner. There's fire exits there and there. Did anybody park between the pylons in the parking lot? Because if you parked between the pylons, a Zamboni truck is going to want to dance with your vehicle. So please, if you did that, please move. Dinner is going to be served sharp at 5:30, so this agenda will be done by then. The format is, in just a minute, we're going to hear from Dr. David Suzuki via Zoom. And then we're going to have 4 presentations. We'll introduce each speaker as we're going along. Each speaker will speak, and there'll be time for questions. 2 people will have microphones and can roam around the room if you want to ask your question in person. So when we get to the question part, if you want to ask a question, put your hand up. Somebody with a microphone will come over to you, and you can ask your question. If you'd rather ask your question more without speaking, I think you could have picked up one of these index cards on the way in. Has everybody got one of these? Did you get these on the way in? If you didn't, put your hand up and somebody will bring one to you. You can write your question on here. There's a hand up here, Sharon. You can write your question on here. And Sharon, if people have a question, that raise their hand, give it to Sharon. Sharon will bring it up here to me, and your question will get asked. So far, so good? Is there anything else I need to say? There will be a break around 4 o'clock, and all of our speakers, I'm looking at them to be sure that we're all at the same meeting. All of our speakers are staying and will be available to have some conversation during dinner. We've set that table up over the side there so they can sit over there, have their dinner, and sign autographs and, and answer your questions. So far, so good? Hands up. Are we all at the same meeting? All right. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. David Suzuki. He's a grandfather. You may have known him as the host for 30 years of The Nature of Things. He's received countless honorary degrees. He's joining us live from his home in Vancouver. David Suzuki, we're pleased to have you here. We're going to turn it over to you, and you've got about 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. I won't take all of 15 minutes because the fact is I don't have anything to contribute to you on the specific issue we're talking about. I can only provide, I hope, a big picture context to consider them. First of all, thank you very much for including me on this important meeting. Thank you all for coming to the meeting on a Saturday afternoon, and especially thank you to the people who are on the speakers list here for, especially Gordon, who I know has been devoting his life to the issue for his entire lifetime. So I feel honored but privileged to be here. I too would like to begin by acknowledging that I speak to you from the traditional stolen lands of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And they are the original occupants of this land and have lived here as a model of sustainability for over 10,000 years. I'm overwhelmed by the fact that the kind of issue you're dealing with in terms of nuclear waste and how we eliminate it is something that is a very long-term issue you're confronting. And I'm overwhelmed with the fact that I just returned from the release of Johan Rockström's latest work on planetary boundaries in New York. I hope all of you know that Rockström has defined 9 areas absolutely crucial for not only human survival and well-being, but all other animals as well. These 9 boundaries include fresh water, the amount of fresh water we have. It includes the pH of the oceans. It includes, of course, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, the nitrogen cycle and phosphorus cycle, and so on. And these 9 boundaries delineate the limits within which we can live in a truly sustainable way. And we've now exceeded 6 of those 9 boundaries. Passing one of the 9 boundaries is scary enough. We've passed 6 of them and are about to pass a 7th boundary. So we're in what's called the extreme danger zone, having passed the safe limits. And according to Johan Rockström, we only have 5 years to get back into the safe zone. So the kind of issues you're talking about, of course, will go on for thousands of years. So if I could just give you a big picture look at why we're in such a mess. I'm a biologist, so I look at humans in terms of biology. And, one of the remarkable things that we've been able to do with modern genetics is using DNA. We can now trace the movement of human beings across the planet over time. And if we then go backwards and follow the trails back over time, they all lead back to Africa 150,000 years ago. That's where our species was born. And I'm still waiting for the Ku Klux Klan to invite me to give a speech so I can tell them we're all Africans. The hell's your problem? That was our birthplace. And if you think of us as an animal, this two-legged furless ape in the grasslands of Africa, we were not a very impressive animal. There weren't many of us. We weren't very big, fast, or strong. Look at how many of us wear glasses. I mean, I wouldn't have lasted very long on those grasslands with my eyesight. And you have to wonder, how the hell did that two-legged furless ape achieve the record that we have? It's a really remarkable a remarkable story. And it's happened very, very recently in our evolutionary time. For 95% of our existence, we were a nomadic hunter-gatherer. We carried everything we owned on our backs, following animals on their migrations, searching for plants through the seasons. We knew we were utterly dependent on, we were embedded in the natural world and utterly dependent on nature for our survival and well-being. Well, you ask, how did we survive over that time? Well, of course, our evolutionary survival strategy was based on the human brain. We were smart, and we were curious, we were observant, we remembered, we were inventive, and those qualities helped us in our survival over time. And I think one of the most important attributes that emerged from that brain was that we recognized that we invented an idea, a notion called the future. I mean, the future doesn't exist. It's just an idea from the human brain. The only thing that exists is now and what we can remember from the past. But because we invented the notion of a future, we realized we could affect the future by what we do in the present. As if, based on what we know, if we look ahead, we could see where there were dangers and where there were opportunities. And we could choose a path to avoid danger and exploit opportunity. That was our great gift. Now, of course, it's simple. In the beginning, we are walking along a path that branches in two, and we remember, oh yeah, Dad went on to the right. He damn near got killed by a saber-toothed tiger, but Mom went to the left and found something good to eat. So I'm going left. Foresight was that great survival strategy of our species. Look ahead, see the dangers, and avoid the dangers, exploit the opportunities. And we've embedded the importance of that strategy in the stories that we tell each other. Joseph, when he was taken to Egypt by his captors, Joseph had this ability to read dreams. And I'm not a Christian, but I know that in the Bible, Joseph's ability to read dreams gave him the warning that they were in for a series of years of drought. And he told the Pharaoh, store grain, there's a famine coming. And because of his foresight coming from reading dreams, they survived the 7 years of famine. And Noah, of course, was building an ark, or he was a carpenter, and the voice said, build an ark. He said, I'm just a carpenter. My neighbors will laugh at me. Build an ark. There's a flood coming. And we know what happened then as a result. And the indigenous people, they speak constantly of 7 generations, that what we do should be shaped by 7 generations of our ancestors and the legacy that we received from them. And we should think ahead of 7 generations of our children. And anything that we do, we must see should not in any way discourage the future for our children for 7 generations. And when you think about a political vision, a politician, what is their vision? Well, it can't extend beyond the next election. And, and one election can replace everything that this current generation of politicians will put in place. So it becomes very scary when you realize that we're not thinking in terms of these long-term implications of what we're doing today. And of course, the corporate vision is based on the quarterly report. Every 3 months, their well-being depends on what the quarterly report says. So they're not thinking long-term at all. And their drive is what? Doesn't have a damn thing to do with our well-being at all. It's profit. It's driven by profit. The faster they gain from their actions, the better they are off. So we're in this dilemma that we can't any longer, can't depend on the political or the corporate agendas to take into account something as serious as what we do with our nuclear waste. We should look at our biology. We're a terrestrial, air-breathing mammal. We live on the surface of the planet, but our whole behavior has been based on the notion since the Industrial Revolution. We don't have to be bound by biological constraints at all. We're so smart that we have broken through all of the limits dictated by our animal nature. I mean, with telescopes, we can peer to the edge of the universe. With microscopes, we've discovered a world of life in a drop of water. Our machines work tirelessly around the clock. They're so huge they can move mountains. We can create lakes behind giant dams. We can escape gravity and live in outer space. We can explore right to the bottom of the ocean. We can pierce the crust of the planet. There seems to be no limit to what we can do, except our imagination. And now we've invented machines that can think more than us and can do our imagining for us. So what's gone on as we've escaped the constraints? Well, we've created problems that come from our technology, our science and technology. And we've seen how powerful our technologies can be, but how ignorant we remain about how the world works. When Paul Mueller discovered that DDT kills arthropods, including insects, but doesn't seem to affect plants or mammals, we thought, this is fantastic. We gave him a Nobel Prize in 1948. DDT began to be used massively, and we discovered a phenomenon we didn't know anything about called biomagnification. Spray at low concentrations, it's magnified up the food chain till you get to the breasts of women or the shell glands of birds, and you've concentrated DDT tens of thousands of times. How could we manage something as powerful as a pesticide like DDT when we didn't even know there was a phenomenon of biomagnification? When nuclear bombs were dropped on Japan, we didn't know there was a thing called radioactive fallout. That happened years later when bombs are tested over Bikini. We didn't know there were electromagnetic pulses of gamma rays that knock out electrical circuits. And it was only long after nuclear bombs had been unleashed that we discovered that there was a possibility of nuclear winter or nuclear fall. We didn't know any of these things. And then we're left at the end with a dilemma. We've invented nerve gases that are so powerful that one drop on your skin will kill you. And when we finally realized how dangerous these were, we had to sign treaties to get rid of them. What did we do? We dumped them in the deepest part of the oceans. Out of sight, out of mind. That's been the principle of this has got to be the most dangerous thing I can think of, to drop these deadly nerve gases into the oceans on the belief that we're out of trouble because the canisters that we've stored them in will last. Anybody that's lived on the ocean for any length of time knows how corrosive ocean waters are. The idea that these powerful chemicals can be contained as long as they're in the bottom of the ocean, is crazy. And of course, that's the issue with nuclear waste. We've created this enormous problem, and now we've got to somehow get rid of them. And the usual out of sight, out of mind. But we know nothing below the surface of this planet. You know, it's staggering. If you reduce the Earth to the size of a basketball, the layer of soil on which we are utterly dependent to grow the food that we depend on would be 1 atom thick. It's a thin, thin layer. The atmosphere would be thinner than a layer of saran wrap. That's the limits. And we've created this enormous problem with the waste by concentrating these radioisotopes in the machines that we use. And now the question is, how the hell do we get rid of them? Get them underground. The deeper we go, the better we are. We don't know anything down there. But I can tell you, up until very recently, we thought that life ended at bedrock. And we thought it was sterile from that point on. But we kept drilling deeper and deeper, and the drill bits kept getting contaminated with microorganisms. And people finally had to admit those are not contaminants that were on the drill bits when they went down. They're coming from down there where we're drilling. And we now know that life goes down kilometers deep underground. And Stephen Jay Gould said, well, gee, if life is now, life on the surface of the planet is a very thin layer, but if you go down and there's life down, 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 even though it's microbial life, if you're down 6 or 7 kilometers and you assume 6 or 7 kilometers around the planet, and then assume the concentration is about the same, very low, the amount of protoplasm underground will be greater than the amount of protoplasm above the ground. That's with all the trees and the whales and the elephants and everything. There's more protoplasm underground than above. What do those microorganisms do? We have no idea. Anybody that knows any biology, these bacteria have been down there for millions of years while all kinds of things are going on the surface of the planet. And they were stuck down there. Some of them only divide every 500 years. And they're down there eking out an existence. When a water molecule comes, boy, they grab onto that. We have to invent new phyla to classify them. Phyla are just under kingdom. They're, these are like finding dinosaurs deep underground. We know nothing about them. We know nothing about energy transfer deep underground from the magma through the upper layers. We don't know what the flow of water is involved and whether life is involved. We don't know anything. And yet we're willing to put them at jeopardy because we've created a problem. We got to get our stuff down there. Let me just tell you, this is kind of not relevant to the nuclear issue, but I was giving a lecture at Princeton, and the world leader who on studying these underground microorganisms was there. And I said to him after my talk, I said, they're planning to pump billions of tons of carbon dioxide into the ground. What's that going to do to the life that you're working on? He said, I have no idea, but the methanogens will love it. I said, what's that? He said, those are bacteria that eat carbon dioxide and make methane. Methane, as you know, is over 80 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So we're going to pump carbon dioxide down there, hoping to store it when the methanogens which will convert that carbon dioxide into 80 times more powerful a greenhouse gas. And we have no idea what's going to happen. So this just illustrates the lunacy right now, despite the work that's going on in these microorganisms. The biggest plan that that the oil industry in Alberta is supporting is capture the carbon and carbon dioxide and pump it back into the ground. Carbon storage and sequestration. And, you know, this is what the nuclear industry, of course, comes to us, and it's basically out of sight, out of mind, except that they've got an issue here. We're talking not where our safety standards have to be not measured in years or decades or even centuries, but millennia. First thing is, who's accountable for the consequences of this? Who can we throw in jail or fine? So there's no accountability in any of this. So that's one thing to always keep in your mind. The people who have created the problem are going to try to eliminate the problem in the cheapest way they can. How are they accountable for what they're proposing? So think about that. A politician, they think no further than the next election. So again, political accountability is a very short thing, and we're dealing with issues thousands of years into the future. The ones who will pay the price, if there are unexpected consequences, are going to be future generations, probably way more than 7 generations. So this is a context within which I'd like you to have your deliberations, understanding that we've grown so powerful in terms of science and technology, but the amount that we know about the world in which we live is so limited. We have no idea of the long-term consequences of our powerful technologies. I would say if the technologists and the scientists involved in disposal are so confident in the safety of their issues, then they should do it in the cities which are demanding the energy coming from the nuclear plants. Okay, if it's safe and you want to pump it down and store it under the city, which is where the people are demanding that energy. I'm sorry I don't give you anything that will help you in your conversation for the rest of this meeting, but I thank you for giving me the opportunity to present a few ideas to you. Thank you.
Thank you, David Suzuki, for joining us. And I think, as he said, he set the context for us for the conversation we're going to have. I'm very pleased to invite to the microphone Dr. Gordon Edwards, who is the president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. And as Gordon makes his way here, I think we could, if you don't know this now, if you didn't know before, you should know it now. Dr. Gordon Edwards has dedicated his life to this and has supported many organizations, many communities for many decades, and he's a national treasure, and we're glad to have him here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks to Protect Our Waterways for inviting me. Thanks to you, good people, for showing up. And it's been said a couple of times that I devoted my life to this. Well, not my entire life. But I did discover that when I graduated from University of Toronto with a gold medal in mathematics and physics, I thought nuclear power was great. I thought it was clean, safe, and abundant because that's what I was told in high school. And I was really shocked when I discovered the existence of radioactive waste of such danger. And I thought, how is it possible that the industry has not told people about this before now? Because for the first 30 years of the nuclear age, the politicians and the decision makers who approved building these reactors and creating this waste knew nothing about this problem. They were told that nuclear power is clean. So right away, the nuclear industry started with a lie. And I believe that the problem is, as Suzuki mentioned, there's so much ignorance that we have about what happens under the ground, what happens in the world, the world of living things. That we don't have the power to simply abandon these wastes and assume that they're going to be safe for future generations. In a way, the industry is simply saying, we want to draw the line and say, we are no longer responsible. It's your problem now. And I believe that that's unethical and unscientific. What's more is that we do have the technology for safely storing this waste on the surface, for keeping it out of the environment. And as long as we keep an eye on it and manage it, you know, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization calls it adaptive phased management. Well, abandonment is not management. It's the opposite of management. If you abandon a baby, you're not managing it. If you abandon a waste problem, you're not managing it. So the word itself is deceptive. It's not adaptive phase management, it's adaptive phase abandonment. And that's the fundamental problem. Now, my organization has mentioned an alternative approach, which is rolling stewardship. And rolling stewardship simply means not abandoning it. It simply means keeping an eye on it, managing it properly, and repackaging it when necessary, improving the containment as you go along, and hoping that the next generation can do a better job than we're doing of keeping this out of the environment for the sake of everybody. Meanwhile, we should probably stop making the waste. I mean, we started making it under the false assumption that it was perfectly safe. Now that we know it's not perfectly safe, maybe it's time to stop. So that's, these are things which have never been properly debated in Canada. Parliament, for example, in Ottawa has never debated the pros and cons of nuclear power, and the country as a whole has never really had a chance to make a decisional statement on this. I'm just going to show you a few slides which indicates how I became involved in this and why I've devoted so much of my life to it. Because I believe as an educated person, I believe I owe it to society to share something back, to give something back for the benefits that I've received in terms of education. It's both basically publicly paid for, and in terms of simply being a responsible human being and sharing information that should be everybody's prerogative. So I would like to, this is not working. Oh, there it is. Okay. In 1943, in Quebec City, our Prime Minister, Mackenzie King at the time, met with the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill, and the three of them agreed on cooperating on building the world's first atomic bomb. This was how Canada got involved in the nuclear power situation. Now, the uranium turns out to be the key element for all nuclear fission technology. Without uranium, there would be no atomic bombs or nuclear weapons of any kind. And without uranium, there would be no nuclear reactors of any kind. And without uranium, there would be none of this nuclear waste that we're talking about either. So uranium is the key to all this. And Canada, it turns out, had lots of uranium, and it was scattered over the map. And at the first, during the time of the Second World War, it was way up high near Great Bear Lake, just about 100 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle, in the land of the Satu Dene people who had lived there for many thousands of years. And they were never told that this stuff was dangerous, yet it was, and they suffered the consequences. It's now called the Village of Widows because so many people died from handling this dangerous radioactive material. Now, this is the Hiroshima bomb that was dropped on August 6, 1945. That's a single bomb made from uranium, one single bomb. And as a scientist, I was wondering, where does the energy from uranium come from? Why is there so much energy there? It's quite a mystery, really. It turns out that going back to 1896, Henri Becquerel in Paris discovered that uranium is energetic. Even a lump of uranium ore out of the ground gives off a kind of an invisible ray that's able to expose a photographic plate. Even if it's blocked with thick black paper, it'll go right through that paper. And so there's energy there, and when you put it in a cloud chamber, you can actually see the tracks of the particles that are coming off this rock. The amazing thing is that energy is pouring off that rock 7 days a week, 365 days a year for millions of years without ever stopping. So there's an enormous amount of energy in the uranium. And they added up mathematically how much energy would come off in a few thousand years, and they figured, wow, you have enough energy there to destroy the Earth. But there's no trigger for doing it because the radioactivity cannot be speeded up or slowed down. It cannot be stopped. And that's why we have radioactive waste, because radioactivity cannot be stopped. And yet it does great damage because when it comes in contact with human beings, it damages the living cells. Marie Curie discovered that inside the same rock where the uranium is, there's other radioactive materials. She discovered two of them, radium and polonium. These are naturally occurring radioactive elements. But turns out they're very dangerous. By 1920, they knew that thousands of young girls who were hired to paint watch dials and instrument dials to make them glow in the dark using radium paint started dying terrible deaths from something called radium jaw, where their teeth were falling out in their mouths. These are young girls. These are like less than 20 years old. And then they showed an epidemic of bone cancer and so on. And it all came down to very, very tiny amounts of radium that they were getting into their bodies. When they did autopsies, they found that the amount of radium in the girls that were killed was only a few micrograms. A microgram is a millionth of a gram. Incredibly small amount. And it's because there's so much energy contained in these particles, these tiny particles. One of the things that's hard to wrap your mind around is how small a thing could give such a powerful result. Now, there were fatal anemias, there were bone cancers, there were later on head cancers, and also we discovered that radium, when it disintegrates, it doesn't disappear, it turns into something called radon gas. Every atom of radon gas started off as an atom of uranium. It's a leftover, a radioactive leftover from uranium. And we know that this kills thousands of people every year in Canada from just breathing radon gas at home. Now, in 1938, around Christmas time, and this is around the time, just a year before I was born, actually, they discovered a trigger. It's called a neutron. And with this trigger, they can actually release a lot of this energy all at once. And the reason is because the neutron, when it hits a uranium atom, splits it into smaller atoms, and that can release an enormous amount of energy. And that energy can go on and be multiplied by the fact that there's also extra neutrons given off. And that means you can multiply the energy, and that's the secret of the atomic bomb. That little trigger, the neutron, is able to trigger an enormous explosion. And that same process of nuclear fission is what's used in every nuclear reactor. And the bulk of the radioactive waste are those smaller atoms that are created, the broken pieces of uranium atoms. That's most of the radioactive waste, but not all of it. Now, when you look at the fuel bundles that they use right now in Ontario in the Canadian reactors, those fuel bundles could be safely handled. They have uranium in them. They could be safely handled before they go into the reactor, but after they come out of the reactor, one of those fuel bundles would kill any human being in about 20 seconds by just standing a meter away from it. That's how deadly it is. So now the radioactivity dies down, but even after 30 years of cooling off, it would give a lethal dose in about 5 minutes. So inside the reactor, all of the new radioactive waste is created in the core of the reactor. That's that square yellow area. That's where the uranium fuel bundles are. But you know what? All the materials in the circulating system become radioactive. Why? Because the fuel bundles leak. They tell you in the NWMO that the fuel bundles don't leak. They leak all the time. And you see that thing up at the top? That's called a steam generator. It's a boiler. It becomes radioactive. Why? It's because the water carries the radioactivity from the fuel bundles up to the steam generator. Now, here's one of those steam generators. This is actually from Bruce. It weighs 100 tons, and inside the steam generator, there's thousands of little pipes, and they are contaminated with hundreds of radioactive materials. Here's a list of them. Look at them. And you notice some of the materials there, I've highlighted cesium, radioactive cesium, and radioactive iodine, and radioactive plutonium. Now, those are getting into the steam generator because they're leaking out of the fuel bundles. And I tell you this with certainty. There's going to be radioactive iodine leaking out of the fuel bundles if they bring them here, no doubt about it. And you're going to be getting radioactive iodine into your environment for sure. There's no doubt about it. And you're also going to be getting radioactive cesium into your environment. Now, they may be small amounts, but it depends upon how bad the management is. If mistakes are made, if they're big mistakes, if there's accidents which are big accidents, then you're going to get a lot of it. If there's very little mistakes and very careful management, you're going to get a little of it, but you're definitely going to get it. Now, inside the steam generator, there are 8 materials with a half-life of over 1 million years, 13 with a half-life of over 100,000 years, 19 with a half-life of over 1,000 years, and 21 with a half-life of over 100 years. These things are very long-lived, and that's why it's a perpetual problem. So I'm going to go the opposite way. When the fuel comes out of the reactor, it has to be stored for about 10 years in a deep pool of circulating water, because otherwise it will spontaneously overheat. You've all seen the pictures of the Fukushima reactors that melted down in Japan. You know what they melted down from? Because of the radioactive waste. The radioactive waste generates enough heat to melt the core of any nuclear reactor. And that's what happened at Fukushima. It wasn't because of the reactor misoperating. It was because the radioactive waste generated the heat that melted it down. Now, when they take the CANDU fuel out of the CANDU reactor, they put it in a dry storage container, which empty weighs 60 tons and full weighs 70 tons. So the container weighs 6 times more than the fuel it's storing. And why is that? It's because they got to keep the workers safe from the radiation of those fuel bundles. Those are the fuel bundles they want to bring up to Teeswater. And to bring them up here, they're going to put them into storage containers, transport containers, and they're going to ship them over roads. And then they're going to put them into what are called hot cells. And they're going to manipulate these millions of fuel bundles. They're going to take them out of the transport containers and put them into the burial containers, which, by the way, these are pictures of hot cells in other places, because Ontario Power doesn't have any hot cells. They have no experience with this stuff. This is all going to be a new learning experience for them. It's brand new. In fact, they're making it up as they go along, because when this first came up, I raised this question a couple of years ago during my talk to the CLC, and up till then, nobody in this community, I think, had heard about hot cells and about what they're going to do to repackage it. But handling these fuel bundles is dangerous, because when you handle them, they're out of containment and they're still leaking. And that leakage is going to be what you're going to be facing with. Now, these are the storage containers, but you know what? If you try and put them in there, they're put in robotically. They can't be put in by human hands. They're put in robotically. In the Bruce reactors, one time, they have what they call fueling machines in the Bruce reactors. Those are robotic things too. They crushed one of the fuel bundles. One fuel bundle in one of the reactors, Bruce Unit 1. As a result of that, when they did the refurbishment of Bruce number 1, the pipes had a lot of crushed radioactive material in it, and the workers ended up breathing radioactive dust for about 3 weeks, and 500 workers ended up breathing into their lungs radioactive plutonium-contaminated dust as a result of one fuel bundle that got crushed. So it's dangerous when these things get damaged. They are the containers of the waste inside. When the fuel bundles get damaged, even a little tiny crack or a little tiny pinhole allows the contents inside to escape. And that's how it gets out into the environment. Now, you see this little fuel pellet here. This is a ceramic fuel pellet, and they always say, look how solid it is. But you know, after it's used in the reactor, it's no longer solid. It's cracked. It's fractured. This is what the pellets really look like. And it turns out that there's radioactive gases and vapors that collect in the gap between the fuel pellet and the outer cladding, which is called those are the fuel rods. And that stuff contains the iodine, the radioactive iodine that I was telling you about a minute ago, and the radioactive cesium. They're in that gap. As soon as there's any damage to the fuel bundle, it's going to get out. And of course, how are they going to keep it all in? Because it comes out as a kind of a gas. And then in the case of iodine, it sticks to the grass, and when the cows eat the grass, they concentrate it into their milk, And when the kids drink the milk, they concentrate into the thyroid gland. And it's just what David Suzuki was talking about. It's a magnification of about 10,000 from the iodine in the air to the iodine in a child's thyroid gland. It's a concentration of about 10,000. It harms the thyroid. It causes not only cancer, but also growth abnormalities, such as things like mental retardation and shrunken growth. There are different things, you can look it up. Thyroid abnormalities in young children can have grave effects. Now, if you look closer, you see that there's a lot of materials that are in the gap, not just the iodine and the cesium. There's other materials there too. And even in the cracks, there's these, at the edge of the cracks, there's other materials which are called, there's even gas bubbles, which are at the grain boundaries, and those are easier to release as well. So these are all materials which are capable of being released with any damage to the fuel bundles. Plutonium, by the way, migrates to the rim of those ceramic fuel pellets. Now, once that stuff gets out, it goes into the food chain, and it becomes part of the food we eat, it becomes part of the water we drink, it becomes part of the air we breathe, and that's how it gets into your body. And once it's in your body, that's where it can lodge and stay for quite a while and end up doing a lot of damage. And this iodine that we're talking about, iodine 129, it has a half-life of 16 million years. So it's going to be here permanently. Is that something you need in this environment? I don't think so. The cesium-135 has a half-life of 3.5 million years. So once it's here permanently. And again, the question is, why do you need any of that? You don't really need it. So I'm going to stop now. We got 5 minutes, is that right? 10 minutes. Okay, good. That's fantastic. Now, back in 1978, there was a hearing in Ontario that I participated in. It's called the Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning. And at that point, Canadians had not even heard about nuclear waste up until that point. And the Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning said, this is shocking and dangerous, and you've got to solve this problem. And if you can't solve this problem, and they said they hope by 1985, if you can't solve this problem by 1985, there shouldn't be any more nuclear reactors built. So the nuclear industry is trying to find a solution to this problem, which is really, for them, a public relations problem. If they can't solve the public relations problem of getting the waste out of the vicinity of the nuclear reactors, then they won't be allowed to continue producing the waste. So the whole purpose of the underground repository here is to give them a license to continue producing the waste indefinitely into the future. And of course, if we continue producing the waste at new reactors they want to build, then that means that all of this is in vain, because even putting it underground, you haven't made the surface any safer, because there's all those reactors producing waste all the time, and you still have a catastrophe potential at the surface as well. So you haven't even done Canadian society the great service that you might think you're doing to them. Unless you stop producing the waste, that catastrophe potential is always going to be there. So it's a form of these radioactive poisons. They can't be shut off. The radioactivity can't be shut off. That's why we have a nuclear waste problem. And I have to go the other way. I keep pressing the wrong button, excuse me. Now, once this stuff gets into the body, it goes to different areas. I mentioned the radioactive iodine goes to the thyroid gland. It also goes to the gonads, the ovaries, and it causes damage there as well. Radiation can not only cause cancer, but it can also cause genetic damage. That means if it affects the eggs or the sperm, then you can get genetic damage that's passed on to children and grandchildren. And that can happen at low doses, but it doesn't happen to everybody. It's something that happens to a fraction of the population. Not everybody gets cancer, not everybody gets genetic damage, but those that do, they're just as sick and just as dead if they die as if they didn't. So if we take a look at the radiation in the environment, it's really a question of population. It's really not so much an individual question, it's a question of the health of the population. And if you have radioactive materials going into the environment, then it's going to go into the food, it's going to go into the fish, and some people are going to get cancer. Not everybody, but But if you have a larger population, then we say, even though the amount of radioactivity is exactly the same as it was before, because you have more people, you say that's a larger population dose, and then you get more cases of cancer. So the cases of cancer are proportional to the number of people who are exposed to it. That's one of the reasons they look for small communities. They look for small communities where the population isn't too big, because then the number of cancers that are caused by radiation are not so evident. They're not so prominent. They don't stick out so much. If you have a large population, it becomes more evident that you're really killing people. And these are girls, these are women, young women in Russia, up near where they did reprocessing. Reprocessing refers to opening up the fuel bundles to get out the plutonium. And by the way, just a week ago last Thursday, there was an NWMO person who spoke at a meeting that took place, and he said, oh yes, reprocessing, it's not quite ready yet, but it's certainly in the works. So I mean, reprocessing is certainly something that is being looked at. In fact, the Canadian government has passed a law called BC21, and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is right now looking at how to change their regulations. It says that if you have any facility where they're actually handling plutonium, and that would be if they do reprocessing to extract the plutonium from the fuel bundles, then you have to have a militarized, heavily armed security force that uses weapons which are prohibited by law. They're allowed to use prohibited weapons, which means includes submachine guns and fully automatic guns, because the plutonium has got to be protected against any potential criminals or terrorists. And that security force is also authorized to survey the population around in case there are any people who might be susceptible to bribe or criminal influences, to make sure that the plutonium is going to be kept safe. So what this means is that society has to be put at a disadvantage for the advantage of the waste. I think I'm going to wind it up there. Thank you very much, everybody.
Stay here. Stay here, because we're going to ask you questions.
Sure, thank you.
Questions? Back at the back there, Sharon or David. Back to the right at the back hand there. We're testing the microphone. Microphone's on its way.
Wow.
The NWMO frequently states that we don't need to be worried about the nuclear waste radiation because even bananas are radioactive. Can you please explain the difference between bananas and man-made radiation?
Okay, that's an interesting question. On our website, my group is called the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. The website is very simple to find. You just Google it. It's ccnr.org. And we have a debunking of that banana myth by the Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory itself. And these are nuclear scientists who are saying that myth about radioactive bananas is not really true. If you eat bananas, it's true that bananas are radioactive. It's because of a certain small form of potassium, which is radioactive. It's true. All foods that have potassium in them are radioactive. But the body has dealt with this ever since the dawn of time, and the body has regulated itself so that it does not allow the potassium to get out of balance in the body. It's called homeostasis. So that when you eat bananas, the body accommodates and gets rid of a certain amount of potassium to keep it in the same ballpark. And as a result, you don't get more radioactive as a result of eating bananas. It is true that bananas are radioactive. It is true that people are radioactive, but those are radioactive materials which are naturally occurring and which the body has adopted to over millions of years. The stuff that's produced by the nuclear industry are not as old as I am. They were not here 85 years ago. They've all been created since then. So nature has no way to adapt to those.
Other questions? Right here. Oh, right at the back and then over here. Okay, go ahead.
Presentations.
Start over.
So
Start over.
So there is pictures what the NWO uses in their presentations about the nuclear cycle from uranium mining to the nuclear waste. And they call it a cycle. Even in the picture, they make it almost a cycle. So in my view, it's a chain, but why does NWMO use the phrase cycle? Can you give an answer or insight to my question?
Thank you, Rita. That's a good question. Basically, the fact that they talk about the nuclear fuel cycle reveals their intentions. Their intention is to extract plutonium because that's the only way you can recycle this fuel. The only way it can turn into a cycle is if you do reprocessing. Now, it turns out that reprocessing has been done at many sites on Earth, mostly for military purposes, and they are among the most contaminated sites on Earth. For example, Hanford, Washington, they did a lot of reprocessing for the American bomb program there, and the cost of cleanup for that site, according to the Government Accountability Office, is between $300 billion and $640 billion. Can you imagine? And this is money simply to clean up a mess. And by the way, nobody knows for sure what cleanup means. So that's a real problem. And every reprocessing site that we've had so far on the face of the earth has been a disaster environmentally, in terms of both financially and environmentally. So I would say that when they say the nuclear fuel cycle over and over again, the NWMO people, they're basically telling you, without mentioning plutonium, that they're going to go after the plutonium.
Thank you. Question here. Not working.
Is it working? There we go. So I recently this year actually just had a radon system put into my house. I'm not in Teeswater, I'm by Lucknow. But I've been told by a number of people, because I've been warning them about it, that Teeswater is actually already very high levels of radon in a lot of houses here. If there were to be a nuclear dump put in the area, is there any estimates on how much that would affect? Like, I know it depends on how much damage there could be and how much leakage there could be, but is there any way of estimating how much radon there would be released? Because my system, when it was put in, they basically can't do any more. If radon levels go up, they can't take any more out of my house.
Right. Radon is, in fact, a serious killer. It's the #1 cause of lung cancer among non-smokers. And also, there's a radon, when radon disintegrates, it turns into a substance called polonium. And and that ends up in tobacco, in tobacco that's grown with radioactive fertilizer. And so the smokers also get most of their radiation, most of their lung cancers from a radon daughter product, a radon disintegration product. When you bury the waste, originally there's not much radon there, but as the centuries go by, more and more radon builds up, and even after 1 million or 10 million years, there will be an enormous amount of radon coming off that waste. And the reason why is because every atom of radon, as I told you earlier, every atom of radon starts off as an atom of uranium. And so if you bury all this waste down there, what you're actually doing is creating an artificial uranium mine, because that becomes a depository of uranium, and that will generate a huge amount of radon gas, but it takes a long time for it to really come to the surface. So it won't be an immediate problem, but it'll be a problem for your remote descendant. There will be an awful lot more radon here.
Back there.
Question, excuse me, for yourself and the other speakers for later on, especially Theresa, a legal definition. I'm astounded at how the NWMO continue to misrepresent the whole DGR issue, calling it a settled science or best practices when there is no functioning DGR anywhere in the world, and the 3 prototypes have more or less failed, the 1 in the US and 2 in Germany. How do they get away with this misrepresentation to the world? I've been going to the public meetings here for the last couple of years. I've submitted at the NWMO question, I submitted that very question to them only for it not to be read, because they censor it that way. So
Yeah.
how does this continue to happen? And
Well-
I'm baffled. Please.
Yeah. Well, in my view, it's very similar to the tobacco industry denying that cigarette smoking causes disease, you know. If you're in an industry that is causing harm, you don't want to admit it's causing harm because then you're on the hook for it. And so you want to cover it up. And the industry is basically saying that there's a universal consensus among scientists that geological disposal is the best way to go. What they should say is there's a consensus among nuclear scientists, not among all scientists, among nuclear scientists. And why is that? That's because all the nuclear scientists are in the same problem. They don't know what to do with this waste. And so they're all hanging together and saying, this is the best we can come up with. We can't think of anything else. But it all involves abandoning the waste. And abandoning the waste when you don't really know what's going to happen. I'll just tell you two scientists who spoke about this. One of them was a Nobel Prize winner, a Swedish Nobel Prize winner in physics. His name is Hannes Alfvén, and he worked in the nuclear program of Sweden for many years before coming to California. And he said, you cannot claim that a problem is solved just by pointing to all the efforts that have been made to solve it. And that's where we are with the DGR. It's not a solution, but they can't think of anything better if they want to abandon it. What we're saying in my organization is don't abandon it. You have an obligation to look after it. You have an obligation to let future generations know what we're leaving them and how to manage it best for their purposes. And they can improve. They're going to be smarter. They're going to have people who know more than we do. They're going to do a better job than we're doing. And maybe, look, this waste is only 85 years old, not even. Maybe in 100 or 200 years, they will actually come up with a complete solution. They'll be able to neutralize it, render it harmless. Who knows? I have no idea. But in the meantime, we should not put it out of human control. Thank you. Stay here.
Hang on just a second. We're going to have one more question, and then we're going to go to the next speaker. Go ahead. You got it? Hang on a second.
Hold on. It should be okay.
Why is our government rebuilding nuclear plants when they should have got our power from the water in Quebec?
Yes, that's a very good question. Why is our government rebuilding nuclear plants, new nuclear plants? I think it's because they have been listening to the nuclear salesmen. The nuclear salesmen have free access in Ottawa. They can go into any minister's office and talk to them in private and give them a good, solid sales pitch. And they have convinced them, falsely, that this is the only way to solve the climate crisis, when in fact, solar energy and renewable energy generally is about 3 to 4 times cheaper than nuclear all over the world. And in fact, the share of nuclear electricity worldwide has been sharply declining for the last 25 years. The amount of the nuclear share of global electricity use has gone down from 17% down to less than 10%, and is still going down. And this is not a solution to climate change. It's enormously expensive, it's enormously dangerous, and it's a dead end. It's like roaring down full speed, putting the accelerator to the floor into a dead-end alley with a brick wall at the end. It doesn't lead you anywhere.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. I have two questions here that I'm hoping other speakers will speak to because I think they're general questions. One is, what can we do to push the NWMO to be good stewards instead of aborting their waste or abandoning their waste? And we are up from Stratford because this issue affects us too. How can we do a better job of getting the word out? So I'm hoping that the other panelists, as they speak, will speak to those. I'm pleased now to invite to the microphone Dr. Dale Dewar, former Executive Director of Physicians for Global Survival. Dr. Dewar.
I think that's the right height for me. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I come from Treaty 4 territory, ancestral land of the Cree, Saulteaux, and Assiniboine. I'm also a rural family physician. which means that I am a Jack or Jill of all trades and a master of many. I set bones and I shock hearts. I do the same things that many emergency room doctors do in the urban setting. I became interested in this topic as a topic of health in the 1990s when I was working in northern Saskatchewan and had patients with renal failure secondary to uranium. That was because uranium is a heavy metal, not because it's radioactive. It also acts like estrogen in humans, and consequently we get diseases among men that we did not see previously in the north. We get lupus, for example, as one of the side effects. I think I've created this as ionizing radiation in health because I've spent the last 4 years reading just about everything I could on the topic, and I also registered to take a health physics course. Interestingly, the course was canceled only because there were not enough people interested in taking health physics at the university, and it was offered by the Department of Physics. I'm going to bring us back to got it? Okay. Right. Oh, I can see it. In 2012, we received, when I was working as the executive director, we had so many questions about ionizing radiation in health as a result of the Fukushima accident that the assistant that I had working with me, Florian, said, why don't we put all the information that we're giving out into a book, which we did. And I've been since asked to update it, but I think that it'll be an entirely different book. I would like to call it Fraudulent and Forever, but Dr. Edwards tells me that the nuclear industry is so touchy about that I better be careful. So that way or that way? Okay. People were thrust into the side effects of ionizing radiation with the use of atomic bombs. This is a picture of the fallout from testing from the 1953 to 1970, covering the United States. The colors don't go past the 49th parallel, do not go into Ontario, as you can see, do not include Teeswater or Toronto, because Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau did not want to include them in the American testing. So we do not know how much fallout occurred north of 49 or the Great Lakes, etc. But as you can see, with the dark brown sections, that was the most fallout. And it goes all the way to virtually to the Canadian border. This caused an incredible increase in leukemias. And I think that it continued to cause the increase that the American Cancer Society in the 1970s called a cancer epidemic. They stopped using that term. This little slide is just of one person's, it's very poorly printed up, but Catherine Benke was a nurse or doctor, a healthcare professional who was working in the area of the downwinder of the Trinity test. Now, the Trinity test of an atomic bomb occurred before they dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was a test. It was a test to see if a plutonium bomb would actually work. Needless to say, it worked. But it also caused a mortality in newborns in the one county that Catherine Benke was watching. Catherine reported this to the Manhattan Project physicians and was told, "Oh no, that's not. You've just looked at your data incorrectly," and she was totally brushed off at the time. Another physicist, did a research looking at all of the births and the children that reached 1 year of age, going back from the 1930s until the end of the 1950s, and discovered that as long as they were doing atmospheric tests, there was a decrease in the number of children that reached their first birthday. He considered that there were 400,000 children missing through all of the testing years. His research was not printed in a normal research journal, but it was printed in Esquire under the title, "The Death of All Children," and you can look that one up. That really upset the Atomic Energy Commission in the United States, and they then went to find a doctor who would help them, make atomic energy good or nice, because they were hell-bent on having atomic bombs. In order to have atomic bombs, as President Macron of France said, you need atomic energy. Eisenhower knew that. He gave the famous speech in 1953 to the UN on the safe use of nuclear bombs for peaceful purposes. And shortly thereafter, the Atomic Energy Commission hired Dr. John Goffman, both a physicist, I think he's actually a chemist, PhD chemist and a medical doctor, to head their health division and health laboratory. But I'm going to go back a little bit in history and get those guys that Dr. Edwards mentioned at the beginning. Becquerel discovered natural radiation in 1896. But 3 months earlier, William Röntgen discovered X-rays. And I'm going to use X-rays a bit because X-rays are easy to measure. You know exactly how much you're giving someone. You can dial in the dose, and you get to see the image. So it's also then easy to measure the side effects of the X-rays, whereas it's much more difficult to sort out the side effects of gamma rays, which are the same as X-rays, maybe a little bit more excitable. And the one comes from the natural environment. X-rays can be turned off and on with a switch. So while gamma rays cannot be turned off, nor can beta or alpha rays. Can I turn this? Oh, I do this right. When Röntgen found his X-rays, he called them X-rays because X is the universal symbol for something you don't know what it is. And I'll want it back. And X-rays caused a revolution in medicine because now we could see the insides of people. We could see broken bones. We could see bullets that were lost inside of somebody. And doctors not only used it, but they used it a lot. And they used their hands to focus the X-rays. And they very quickly discovered a direct side effect of radiation was reddening of the skin and loss of the hair and peeling. But the tumors that they were focused on shrank. So that made them want to have more and more X-rays because therefore you could use them that way. In France, Marie Curie was busy taking uranium ore apart into its bits, discovering the polonium and the radium, as mentioned, and for her PhD. For her PhD, Lord Rutherford from the UK had come over to visit them at the time that she received her degree to pay honor to Madame Curie. And while they were having their very nice tea party in the Curie's rose garden, and this became dark outside, Pierre went and brought out a vial that contained radium. Now, radium oxidizes the air around it, turns it slightly blue, and it has a somewhat pulsating appearance to it. So everybody goes through the oohs and ahs of how beautiful this is. But Lord Rutherford notices in his journal that evening that Pierre Joliette Curie had the typical changes of one who worked with radiation. This is only 7 years after they've discovered it, and they already know that it's damaging. He already had seen enough of it that he could say the word typical of the radiation. Shortly thereafter, in fact, the next year, the assistant to Thomas Edison died of osteogenic sarcoma. Could you raise this just a bit? I feel like I'm trying to get into it. Thank you. That's better. And he was not alone, because there was an entire rash of doctors dying of osteogenic sarcoma. But there was money to be made in X-rays, and we all know we like money. The physicians with the X-ray machine would make more money, and many unscrupulous people did so. The excitement of seeing the insides of bodies, the ability to make diagnoses where none had existed before, attracted everybody, really, and it kept the medical profession absolutely tethered to the use of radiation until we've got ultrasound and magnetic resonance imaging, or MRIs, have come along where we can image without exposure to radiation. By 1928, it was possible to establish an international commission on radiation protection with a mission to protect people and animals and the environment from the harmful effects of ionizing radiation. The problem with the ICRP was that it was formed by the people who liked ionizing radiation, worked with ionizing radiation, and promoted ionizing radiation. So when they established the first safety level, they decided that the safety level would be that which, when you had your reddened skin, the redness went away. That was the safety level. They didn't know about all the things they couldn't see. X-rays were used so much that when I was when I was a student in medical school, we X-rayed everyone when they came into the hospital. They had a chest X-ray. Some of you may remember getting chest X-rays when you went into the hospital. And that continued for a decade after I graduated. When I graduated in 1978, President Carter of the United States approved new guidelines for chest X-rays. limiting their use. And he said, radiation exposure could best be reduced by eliminating clinically unproductive X-rays and by ensuring good X-ray technique. He was probably the only president who was a nuclear engineer, and he was among the specialists that were called to Canada during the Chalk River meltdown in the early 1950s. X-rays and gamma rays are, for all intents and purposes, I'm going to repeat this again, are the same. So if X-rays cause cancer, so do gamma rays. Is there a safe level of exposure? Can I turn the slides back on? Yes, thank you. You got me right on the right spot. We evolved in and we live in a radioactive environment, from the potassium in our bananas, thanks for the question, to the radon in the air we breathe. We cannot escape. It's always with us. Does it in fact have an effect upon us? And this graph shows that it does. Just making sure it's on the left-hand side, you are seeing the little dots on the lines represent the children who are at age 16, have spent their first 16 years of life exposed to approximately 0.75 millisieverts. That's the low level. Then on the right side, you see the dots that represent the children at age 16 who have lived in an environment that's about 2.3 millisieverts. So we're talking low levels, but it's pretty easy to see that the right side has more tumors, cancers, and side effects from ionizing radiation than the left side, right? Do I need to explain that anymore? Nope, okay. So background radiation does have an effect upon us. Increasing background radiation will continue to have an increasing effect upon us. And we're not just talking about cancers. We're talking about autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, diabetes, lupus, atherosclerosis, and heart disease. All of these have an increase in incidence upon exposure to background radiation and any radiation. In the United States, the Committee on the Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation is a subcommittee of the U.S. National Research Council. Every once in a while, it publishes a report, seems to be somewhat irregular, but in 2007, their report, referred to as BEER 7, concluded that there is no level of radiation that a person could be exposed to that was guaranteed safe. In other words, every exposure increases our risk of developing cancer or one of the autoimmune diseases or having some sort of effect. How does ionizing radiation cause damage? It ionizes things. It's right in the name. It ionizes things. So if you ionize your enzymes, the cells of the walls of the cells in your body, they don't work right. They don't come back together in the same sort of form as they did before. If you ionize your RNA or your DNA, you change, perhaps permanently, the structure of the cell. And it can change regulatory systems in cells so that they don't know how to stop reproducing, giving us cancerous growth. Just got the 5 minutes, so I'm going to whip along to two other issues that come along, and that is that of effects upon the fetus. Studies were done in and shortly after the Manhattan Project that gave radioactive iron to pregnant women at 28 weeks. consider how egregious that is to start with, but it was even worse because the researchers did not go back and do their follow-up. So we would only know about these studies when the parents of those children sued the company that hired the researchers. So we wind up having a headline until we have a headline in the New York Times that says Vanderbilt sued on radiation. That's New York Times, February the 2nd, 1994. Now, genetic effects. We can't prove that there will be genetic effects from radiation in humans, but we do know that genes are affected. Researchers following Chernobyl's victims have found changes in the genome on particular sites. Now, the sites are really a ridiculous name, hypervariable tandem repeat mini satellite loci. How's that, right? But the fact that there are changes at all suggests that there may be more damaging being done. We do know that radiation on fruit flies does cause genetic damage. Herman Muller experimented with fruit flies, and in 1928 found those damages. Fruit flies have very, very big chromosomes. You didn't need an electron microscope to see them. And his result of his studies in the 1928 received a Nobel Prize, but he also became very fearful about what human beings were doing to themselves by the use of radiation. With his fruit flies, it took about 10,000 generations in order for the numbers of changes to create deformities that would cause a die-off. We've been talking about waste that will last more than 10,000 generations in humans. Mark it out, right? 10,000 generations in humans is going to be what? 120,000, 250,000 years. And we've got waste that's going to last longer than that. And I'm just going to close with a quote from Dr. John Goffman, the first department head of the Health Division of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, who got squeezed out of his job. I wonder why. Because his statement was, licensing a nuclear power plant is, in my view, licensing random, premeditated murder. It's premeditated because it is known what happens when a nuclear power plant is built. We know that we're building an industry where any release of radiation will increase cancer, and it is random because we don't know who will get it or even what type of radiation will cause it. This was and is not an industry with public health in mind. I'm just going to leave you with a very easy site. This is my blog spot, which contains a much, much longer version of what I said, and also all of the references that are contained in it. Did you want to ask a question? Do we have time? Okay. Right. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Dewar. Okay, we're going to take a 10-minute break. I think there's coffee. I think there's cookies. There's washrooms that way, and we'll reconvene in 10 minutes. Thank you. In our spots, I'd like you to know that in the back corner, if you haven't seen it already, there are Vote It Matters signs. You can take one home for free. They'd be happy to have a donation towards the cost of signs. And there are also some copies of the hosting agreement back there. You could pick one up and take it home. I'll make those announcements again at the end. I'm going to, as we gather, pleased to welcome to the microphone Brennain Lloyd. She very modestly describes herself as the project coordinator for Northwatch, but like our other panelists today, she too is a national treasure. We're very pleased that she could be with us today. Brennain, come on up to the microphone. Please welcome Brennain.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, all of you. I'm really happy to be here. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm thrilled that all of you are here. This is just great to have this room full of people who are, really engaged in this issue. So I'm Brennain Lloyd, and I'm from Northeastern Ontario. My primary organization is Northwatch, which is a Northeastern Ontario organization. We're generalists. We work on mining, forestry, wastewater, and nuclear waste, the nuclear fuel chain in general and nuclear waste in particular. So I'm your neighbor from the north side of the lake because our region is north shore of Lake Huron north and the east coast of Superior up to the James Bay coast. But I have for a number of years now been working with We the Nuclear Free North, which is a Northern Ontario-wide alliance of groups, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, focused on the nuclear waste management organizations, plan to select and then select a site and then bury and abandon all of Canada's high-level waste in a single site. So that has been a concentration for, I'm doing the down arrow. I hope this doesn't count as my time. So because we're going to do a really rapid run through a short list of topics, I want to talk to you about the siting process, some basics about the project, very briefly about the hosting agreements, and then some summary and conclusions. So that looks to me like that's the up button. So we're going to start talking about the NWMO siting process. Just first, some basics. I know that many of us have been in this conversation for quite a while, but some of us are still new to the conversation. So I still like to talk about, I don't know if the tech people are trying to correct my mistakes or if I'm making new ones with every click of the button, but just the basics. So this idea of burying all of Canada's high-level waste in a single location has been around for decades. It started in the 1970s. 3 men, 3 months asked to study the problem of nuclear waste, and they decided we'll bury it. We'll bury it in the Canadian Shield, but if that doesn't work out, we could always go to the salt formations of the Goderich area, which might now be a surprise to the people of Goderich, but that was the backup plan. 1980s, they did a siting process, basically got, rushed out of town after town, but they did manage to do exploratory drilling in the north shore of Lake Huron and north of Superior at Atikokan. And then they morphed from that into the development of a concept. And we still have a concept. In the 1990s, it was Atomic Energy of Canada Limited's geological disposal concept, went through a lengthy review process, and in the end, the panel was to say, has ACL demonstrated their geological disposal concept to be safe and acceptable? The panel said no. No, it hasn't been, and as additional advice, next steps should be taken by an independent agency, arm's length from industry. And the government said, thanks so much for that advice. We accept it in principle. And then they did pretty much the exact opposite. They created, through a Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, they gave direction to the nuclear industry to organize themselves as a waste management organization. So in 2002, the industry did that, and the Nuclear Waste Management Organization was created. They studied 3 options for 3 years: storage at site, centralized storage, and deep geological repository. And in the end, not surprisingly, they selected deep geological repository as their endpoint. But they did do some very superficial studies of those other two options, and they did not identify that there was any actual cause for not proceeding with one of the other options. They were also feasible, but they said continued storage on site would be more expensive. Move forward. They did that study, 2005, 2007. The federal government said, okay, go ahead. And they moved to create a siting process. And I'm still not having, there. So they created a siting process. It's a 9-step siting process. And we're in the middle of that. So I'm having multiple problems. That's what I'm pressing. That one is down, right? Oh, if I'm holding it upside down. Solved, problem solved. So see how technology can be really tricky to operate. So we've got this 9-step siting process, and we're going to look at the middle steps in particular. So, and I'm going to highlight some of these steps because I think part of our problem that we're in now with the NWMO asking communities to declare their willingness to accept a concept, still a concept, a set of ideas about how this project might work. Some of our problems now stem back to the siting process itself. So back in step 5, that's actually technically, I think, where we probably are now. Communities are supposed to make a compelling demonstration of willingness. This is according to the original siting process. And then step 6, the municipality was to then create an agreement with the municipalities. The NWMO would enter into an agreement. Step 7 would be the environmental assessment, and step 8 would be when the construction would begin and site characterization would happen. So the problems with this are that step 5, the communities are making a compelling demonstration of willingness, i.e. in the case of South Bruce, you're participating in a referendum on October 28th. Before we actually know what the project is, the NWMO has not actually described their project in any level of detail that allows us to really assess the risks and uncertainties and understand and recognize and demand that they respond to the uncertainties. Then so that's step 5. Now step 6 and 5 really got kind of twisted and turned around because they created the agreement, then you'll have the referendum, and then they'll formalize the agreement. But the agreement is all important in this decision page, and in this decision step, because the agreement sets out all of the obligations that the municipality is committing you to. So the agreement is absolutely important. It's a package deal. But that agreement is being made before the NWMO has yet described their project in any kind of detail. And it's happening before step 7, which is the environmental, now called the impact assessment stage, and the first of the licensing stages. We go on to some additional difficulties that aren't even detailed in the siting process because the impact assessment happens at the first licensing stage, which is to prepare the site, way before the NWMO is going to have to present in any kind of detail what's called the safety case, the set of technical arguments where they actually try to demonstrate that they can do this safely. That won't happen until the operating license, years and years down the road. So in step 8 under the NWMO's siting process, if they, and they're still following it loosely and generally, in step 8, they have an option. So in step 8, they begin construction. They begin constructing the underground repository to use it for the purpose of characterizing the site, testing out whether their predictions back in the impact assessment stage were correct or not. In step 8, they also have the option of adding something they call interim shallow storage. So potentially, they can begin moving the waste to the site at Teeswater while they're still testing out whether their predictions back in the impact assessment stage were correct or not, and way before they've got an operating license, so way before they've actually made the safety case, before you've had a chance to actually test those arguments that they're putting forward. Although testing the arguments will be really limited in both the impact assessment stage and the licensing stage. So we've got some real problems with the sequencing of the NWMO siting process, and they're problems that were pointed out to them in advance. But we're now in the final stages of the site selection part of that, and we went from multiple communities. 22 municipalities said, yeah, we'd like to learn how we could economically benefit from your $16 to $24 billion national infrastructure project, because that's what the NWMO offered to them. They didn't, in the initial stage, they didn't say, would you like to receive all of Canada's high-level waste in your community and have it processed there and buried there and abandoned there? No, they said, would you like to learn about our $16 to $24 billion national infrastructure project? We went from 22 communities, now we're down to 2. We're down to one site in the north, the Revel site between Ignis and Dryden, and the site here in Teeswater. So I want to just quickly run through the NWMO project, because they talk about it, adaptive phase management, the deep geological repository. It's got four major stages. Pre-operational stages, we have the siting. Then we have the 4 major stages of extraction, transportation, emplacement, processing, and emplacement. And then after that, post-operation, abandonment. So the first is extraction, and I'm going to go really quick on this, but I want to highlight that extraction is that first step when they have to remove the fuel waste from those dry storage containers. It's been there for decades. We don't know the condition. We know that there have been problems with the fuel defect mechanisms or systems at some of the reactor stations. We don't know the conditions of the waste in that dry storage container. But CNSC staff, Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission staff, said years ago, and it's stuck with me since then, that fuel defects are a precursor to dose. What that means is every time the fuel is damaged, it creates the opportunity for those radionuclides, those hundreds of radionuclides, to move out into the environment, out of the fuel, out of the fuel bundles, into the container, and then eventually out into the environment and into our bodies. So the first step is that extraction, where they'll extract it from the dry storage container. They haven't described this at all. What the NWMO has said is, at each interim storage facility, the waste owner is responsible for doing that. And they say that as if somehow they're separate and different from the waste owner. They are the waste owner. OPG owns 90% of the waste. The 3 provincial utilities that generate radioactive waste by operating reactors are all part of the NWMO, but they say this as if it's some, distant third party. So there's nothing, and I think for people who are here who might live closer to Kincardine or to Tiverton, that might be an issue that you might want to explore as well, because those are a pretty big set of unknowns in terms of what the exposures to workers will be and the releases to the environment will be at that point of transfer. So there's questions about how the waste will be moved from dry storage to transportation containers. There's also a really big question about why they would move the waste twice. Because when we get to the processing stage, you'll see they're going to then extract it from the transportation containers into the final containers through the processing chain. So there's a really big question about why you would move it twice. And then a question, why would the waste be moved to a remote site? And by remote site, I don't mean remote in the, in the far away sense. I mean remote as in away from the reactor station. So next stage is transportation. And I've got a map up that we use in Northern Ontario, but these transportation risks are going to be really large for either site, for the Revel site in the north or Teeswater site here in South Bruce. So the transportation risks, start with that moving into the transportation container. The NWMO has adjusted slightly their description of transportation. They've removed the option of sending it by the Great Lakes. They're pretty much settled into truck with the option of train as sort of a second runner. I think if it was the Teeswater site, it would be all by truck because there isn't, a train connection here. It'll be 2 to 3 trucks a day for at least 50 years. I'm going the wrong way again. So at least 50 years. And the site, the waste will start moving from Pickering first, although that was before the plan to rebuild Pickering again. And it will move by road steadily, 2 to 3 trucks a day over that long period of time. And there are 2 sets of risks, or 2 sets of risks. There's a risk of routine exposure. So risk is probability times consequence. In the terms of routine exposure, it's not so much a probability, it's a certainty. You will be exposed to radiation from the trucks as they pass. It'll be a small amount of radiation. That amount will be larger, of course, if you have a longer period of time beside, behind, or in a proximity to the truck, because dose is distance, exposure is dose, distance, and duration. So if you're closer for a longer time, and I'm at 5 minutes, that can't be true. So one thing the NWMO tells you repeatedly is about the safety tests, the rigorous safety tests that these have been subject to. In fact, they haven't been. In fact, only the one container has been subject to any tests. It was in the 1980s. It was only the first 2 tests, drop and puncture tests. They were partially completed, only partially successful, and on a half-scale container. The other 2 containers are still concepts. Well, the dry storage container was designed for movement within the reactor station. Turns out fire and water tests, water immersion tests, they can replace those tests with computer calculations and modeling. So there is, and there's issues around first responders' exposure during radiological emergencies. And we're very concerned. We did a project in 2018 with first responders and heard that they rely really largely on this emergency response guidebook. And that emergency response guidebook, it dismisses the radiological risk. It says radiation presents minimal risk to transport workers, emergency response personnel, and the public during transportation accidents due to the packaging. Well, that's the same packages that we've heard haven't actually been subject to full-scale tests. So we're very concerned about the exposure as a result of accidents in particular to emergency workers. NWM and CNC also like to talk about their excellent transportation record. In fact, it's hard. We don't have a public registry, but both the CNSC and Transport Canada do identify a record of transportation accidents, including from shipments of low-level waste from Bruce to an off-site unnamed licensed facility. So the accidents do happen, and they will happen, and it's just a matter of time. So far, very fortunate in Canada, no large-scale releases, but that doesn't mean it not happening to date doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. So processing is, I think, a really high level of concern, particularly for people here in Teeswater. Gordon has already done some of the work I would have to do, talking about the used fuel processing plant, the used fuel packaging plant where they process it. It'll move through a number of different hot cells in this facility. There are a number of issues we've identified with what they call more generally the surface facilities, but in particular the used fuel packaging plant. There's going to be defective fuel. It'll be segregated, but they don't say how it will be managed. They say there will be inspection and detection, but they don't describe it all. Again, this is part of it being at such a concept stage. They'll generate waste at the site. They will generate radioactive emissions to air. Workers will be exposed. In this very general description, they still include the detail that they will have an intention to monitor workers who are expected to have a dose exposure above 5 millisieverts. Well, first of all, that acknowledges that they expect some workers will be given a dose above the allowable level, even for nuclear energy workers, which is 5 times the level for the public. But it also says that they're not planning to monitor every single worker, which I think is really, really problematic. Just as another, not so much the processing, but as another example of the kind of at-site concerns, the air underground will be too radioactive. The radiation levels will be too high underground to allow workers to be present, but they will be venting the air from the underground to the surface, and they won't be filtering it. They will only turn the filters on if there's an unexpectedly large release, and they say they'll have 3 minutes to get that filter on. And I've got 2 minutes. So emplacement, they've said very little about emplacement. They're going to transfer it underground. There's a whole list of uncertainties with the way each of the barriers will work. There's scientific uncertainties that have been identified by scientists who are not part of the industry's so-called consensus. So more work may or may not make the safety case. We can do more work. I say NWMO's presented only a concept. More work needs to be done, but it may not arrive at a safety case. So they intend to select a site in 2024. They've got a signed agreement with Ignace. They're working on getting a signed agreement with South Bruce, following the referendum. The First Nations still have to make a decision and haven't said specifically when they'll make that. So there's some observations I just want to share from the Ignace hosting agreement. And I think these will also surface with the South Bruce agreement. So it binds future municipal councils to the agreement. There's no opting out after that agreement is signed. It requires future councils to show up and support the NWMO's project, even regardless of any future concerns that might emerge. The information about the project, including scientific and technical issues information, will be considered confidential within the implementation group. Even communications, this might not be the case in South Bruce. In Ignace, even communications from the council to the community will be reviewed by the NWMO. And it commits the township to providing support and services that the NWMO doesn't necessarily commit to funding. So I know I'm out of time, even though I had 2 more slides I really wanted to share.
Well, you're going to have time. You've got 10 minutes for questions, so you're going to get to sneak it in here.
If anybody asks me about my 2 remaining slides.
That's right. But before you go, we're going to ask for questions. Can I borrow your microphone?
You can.
We're going to ask for questions. And as you're thinking about questions, I've got one here. Somebody sent up for you to get you started, Brennain. According to Schedule B, the financial benefits, the operations end in 2092. Would you know how many spent rods would be contained by that time in Teeswater?
I know that the projection is 7 million. Right now we've got, I think it's 3.3 million. The projections are 7 million. I expect, and that number is based on the currently operating reactors continuing to operate to the end of their currently projected operating period. But we also know that Bruce Power is now proposing Bruce C, and Ontario Power Generation and the Ontario government are talking about rebuilding 4 reactors at Pickering. So I did the calculations for Pickering. That was going to add another 1 million bundles. I expect Bruce C would add at least another 2 million bundles. You know, as Gordon said, as long as they continue to generate the waste, the hottest waste remains at surface, and the deep geological repository and the processing facility can and will not close. So it continues as long as they continue to generate radioactive waste.
When you said 7 million, I saw several people go, wow.
So we're at 60,000 tons right now with the 3.3 million. So we're talking 120,000. These are just very rough numbers. But I think the main point to keep in mind is that it will keep going. As long as they continue to operate the reactors, it will keep going. And so their argument that this will reduce the risk to Canadians just doesn't hold water as long as they continue having fresh, hot waste at the site.
Other questions for right here?
Oh, Bill. Yeah, my name is Erica Simpson, and I'm a professor of international politics in the Department of Political Science at Western University, which is in London, Ontario, Canada. And my question is for Brennain, and it's related to the decision-making process, which is summed up here. I have taught lectures on this to my classes in global diplomacy and global violence in Canada abroad now since 1996. And I always do a short lecture on this topic. I've had 60,000 students, and always the same question is, how come such a small, willing group gets to decide this decision? I counted there's 131 of you here. And you get to decide on an issue that affects the Great Lakes, that affects terrorism, international politics, Canadian politics, and only a small number of you, if you just vote no, they don't care, because the council members will make the decision. My students are fascinated by this lack of democracy. I talked to your counselor a few minutes ago at 2:30. He said he had to cut his beans in the field. This is that's why he's not here. This is going to be affecting not 7 generations, as Dr. Suzuki said, but 100,000 years into the future. And it's just you guys. I don't understand this. Please explain it to me, Brennain, please. Thank you.
Well, the process was designed to get to yes. So that, that's what we're doing here is you have had, by your council inviting NWMO into the community, you are then part of their process, and their process was designed for getting to yes. So that's why. Otherwise, we would have communities along the transportation route. We would have the downstream communities part of the decision-making, and they're not. So that's why. This is a very carefully crafted process to get the industry where they want to be.
Thank you. Right here.
You'll hold it. Excellent. My question is, from where I sit here, it looks like, and I've been down this road on other issues, they've been since 1977 to figure out how to get the smallest group possible with no authority to take on the total burden of this site. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Remember that, everybody.
Okay. I have another question here, Brennain. Pardon me just for a second while I borrow the microphone. If, as part of a DGR project, a repackaging plant is located here within 5 to 10 kilometers of Teeswater, how worried should we be regarding safety and emissions or accidents?
You should be very worried. I mean, of course, just as with transportation, in the processing facility, accidents increase the likelihood or the volume of releases. And, Dr. Dewar already talked about the Beer 7 conclusions, which said that there is no level of exposure to radiation which does not have some level of risk attached to it. There are going to be releases. We can tell even by the minimal information NWMO has provided about the used fuel packaging plan that there will be releases. So that takes us back to that question from, transfer, when I was talking about extracting the waste at the generating station. Your council made an error in signing on to an agreement that included the used fuel packaging plant. There should not be a second handling of the waste. I mean, I don't think, even if you're going to move it ashore, so there's some sites like Pickering, very crowded, congested site. I don't believe in long distance shipment of the waste, but I could see in the case of Pickering, I don't know if the site can accommodate it. Darlington, Bruce certainly can. Laproche, Gentil certainly can. So even if there was going to be any movement of the waste, it should be transferred into its final container when it's removed from the dry storage containers. And NWMO quite purposefully left that, went in the opposite direction. Yucca Mountain, which was a US project, they had initially taken an approach similar to the NWMO, where you'd ship it to the site, then you'd repackage it, then you'd put it underground. And they changed that because of the level of exposures to workers primarily, but also releases to the environment. So now they have a requirement of what they call direct disposal, where they have to put it into its final container at the reactor station. They also have a plan to have a irradiated fuel bay so it can be done underwater, subaqueously, which is the only way that fuel waste is handled in Canada right now on anything but a very, very, very small scale.
2 more questions and 1 more presenter, and then dinner right here, and then over here.
I just want to very briefly, Brennain and Dr. Gordon-Edwards and Dr. Dale, thank you. I specifically am appreciative of the fact that you're pointing out the fact that this is a nuclear fuel reprocessing facility on the surface. The DGR is actually secondary. That nuclear fuel reprocessing facility should be in a remote place a long ways away from people and not near our farmland, including the animals that will not be evacuated if there's a problem. The animals will be left there to die.
Well, actually, Ed, I think it should be at the reactor station where the waste is, where they have the technology, they have the irradiated fuel bay. That's where the transfer should happen.
Brennain, I have requested on several occasions from the NWMO what their monitoring plan for the future is. I've received emails back. The word monitoring is in there 12, 13 times. But when you get to the bottom of the email, basically it says their plan is they plan to monitor, and it'll be determined by future technologies. So I'm wondering if you have been able to get any more information from them, or if that's just it. They hope to have a plan and eventually somebody will figure it out.
So many years ago, they put out a paper that was their monitoring plan, long-term monitoring plan, and it consisted of putting some boreholes in the perimeter and dropping a sensor down, and every 20 years picking it up, reading the sensor, and putting another one down. Some years later, they came out with another paper, which was towards developing a framework for monitoring, which said what you've just said, that they don't have a plan. But when you put the waste... So here's the fundamental problem with a deep geological repository. You're putting the waste 1,000 meters up to 1,000 meters down, then along a corridor that's 1,000 meters long, and then in an emplacement room that's 250 meters deep, and then you're stacking them, and you're stacking them, and you're stacking them, and you're coming out and you're sealing the room, remembering that this is an environment that's too radioactive to have workers present, and then you do that till you work your way out of the repository. So unless they have some system of monitoring within the emplacement room, of monitoring the containers, that old idea they had about monitoring on the perimeter, it would never tell you where the failed waste container was. So once you've put it into that underground location, really the possibility of retrieving, repairing, re-encapsulating the waste is pretty much nil. So if you think about what's required, you need to be able to monitor the waste, measure the performance of the containers, and mitigate it. And when you do that in a deep geological repository, when you put it in a deep geological repository, you've removed that possibility. And Mike told me to make this answer really, really short.
I said as short as possible. That might have been the shortest possible version. 1 more question for Brennain, and then we have 1 more speaker.
Could we, anybody that lives in this area, could we not get a free guider counter to test our radiation, please?
You could do that. There is actually, I think it's called Citizen Safe. There's a citizen monitoring program. The difficulty is, so we talk a lot about gamma radiation, and you know, Dr. Edwards or Dr. Dewar would be more qualified to talk about this than me, but I've got the mic. So we talk about radiation and gamma radiation, but there's also alpha and beta particles, and those aren't caught by a Geiger counter. And by the time you catch something coming off with a Geiger counter, you know, you're already living with the problem. So I would encourage people living near a nuclear facility certainly to monitor the gamma radiation, but it's not going to tell you everything you need to know about what's being released from the used fuel processing facility, packaging plant, or from the deep geological repository.
Thank you, Brennain. I'm pleased to invite Theresa McClenaghan, Executive Director of the Canadian Environmental Law Association. Please welcome her.
Okay, how's that sound? Now, which way's upside right?
Press right and press backwards to go forward.
Okay, and first I need my slides up. There we go. Thank you very much for inviting me today. And in the interest of time, we'll just jump right in. So the Canadian Environmental Law Association is an environmental legal aid clinic and a Canadian NGO. We focus on access to environmental justice and pollution prevention and public health and safety. So today I'm going to talk about some of the implications from an environmental justice framework and a little bit about what it means to be a willing host and who has a role in decision making. And given the discussion that was just happening toward the end of Brennain's presentation, one of the things that I would agree about, and I'll say right up front, is that it's very questionable environmental justice to put so much burden on so few people, because I'm going to be encouraging you to participate. You heard a sign a moment ago about how important it is to vote right now, but that's not the end of it, as you will see. There are many, many decision makers down the road, and it would be critical for the public to stay involved in those decisions. So through my presentation, I'm thinking, who are the right, quote, affected public and the right decision makers? My opinion would be that the affected public is much, much broader than this community, or much, much broader than the community between Ignis and Dryden. But that's not the way the process was designed, as you've heard. You can complain about that. This project is not built yet. All that's happened so far is decades of process. If political actors, like politicians, made a different decision, we could have a different process. Nothing is cast in stone. But some of the questions are the people being consulted the ones who would be most impacted? Brennain's talked about transportation routes, for example, not being consulted. Are Indigenous and treaty rights being respected? Are all of the affected communities being consulted? And what's the geographic definition of the impacted community? And who's making the decision on behalf of the community? Who has that authority? So a few things about roles. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization, you've heard already about them. Just to say, it's an industry-run organization established under federal legislation designed to give this decision-making authority to the industry. In terms of subsequent decisions, there is a regulator, the Nuclear Safety Commission, which will have some licensing decisions, and then under recent changes to environmental assessment law, there's also an impact assessment agency. And we don't have time today, but what I would say about the Nuclear Safety Commission is that I don't consider that decision maker to be adequately independent from the industry that it regulates. In 2016, there was a federal process before we got the new Impact Assessment Act that asked the question of Canadians about what we should have instead, and specifically in respect of nuclear decision-making, nuclear and energy. So they were talking about Nuclear Safety Commission and the National Energy Board. They talked about the high importance of trust and confidence in those decision makers. And so I've got a little quote there. What they were concerned about, because of what they heard about from the public, is that when the authority who has regulatory functions is also making decisions on behalf of the industry, then you have high levels of mistrust. I'm going to switch gears here to uncertainty, and you've heard quite a bit about this from Brennain and other speakers, Gordon and Dale. But just to sum up from a big picture perspective, these are areas of uncertainty that have been true, like Brennain said, back to the 70s, and certainly true in the whole time that this particular siting process has been underway. And these have not been solved yet, but they're perfectly valid questions for you to continue to pose. So how will the fuel properties itself change over these incredible timeframes? NWMO itself says that the fuel will not reach background uranium levels, and you already heard there are still concerns at those levels, but it won't reach those levels for 1 million years. What will happen to geology over that time frame? Think about the time frame for glaciation. In the land acknowledgement, we heard about glaciers retreating 10,000 years ago. Cataclysmic events, both accident and climate change induced and otherwise. And do we know of any human technology that can last that kind of time? Monitoring, we just had a great discussion on, but there are other intractable issues. Intractable means we can't really figure out an answer, like communication issues. And I've mentioned this a few times when I've spoken about this topic. The NWMO included a paper way earlier in their process where they brought forward some of the work of the philosophers discussing the idea of, quote, the long now. And they've posed this thought question, which is, can we think of any way to communicate to the future in a way that will survive? Has that ever happened before? We also have huge uncertainty about the type of waste, and those of you, I see many in the room who were involved in the low and intermediate waste siting facility that did not proceed, but you might remember on the first day of that hearing, several years ago, it was admitted by the proponent that the type of waste that would be emplaced in that facility had changed. So will that happen here? Will there also be other types of waste, low and intermediate? And of course, we already know, which was denied at the beginning of the NWMO process, it won't just be can-do waste. There'll be all kinds of different properties, meaning it's different types of radioactive substances, it's different times of decay, it's different heat, it's different forms of waste. Physically, it's all kinds of issues. And then because of our free trade agreements, there's uncertainty about whether it could even be limited to Canadian fuel waste as well. So what are some of the remaining ethical and moral issues to grapple with as you decide, how you feel about this project? We've heard discussion already about continuing to produce this waste that's so toxic. And let me take a step backward. In Gordon's slide at the very beginning, there was this kind of complicated diagram about the whole process of a nuclear energy plant. But it's just to boil water to produce steam so that you can turn a turbine to get electricity. That is what this is all about. And we're incurring this kind of level and length of time of hazard for the instantaneous electricity you and I are experiencing today that those future generations will never, ever, ever benefit from when we have lots of ways we can produce electricity. Liability, accountability for accidents. I have a big concern about economic arguments, really forcing communities into making these decisions because they've been told there's no other economic future for them. I don't know if that's as true here. But that has been true for many of the 22 communities that the NWMO consulted over time, which in itself is a big ethical problem. So willing host concept, I'm just about out of time, but the NWMO has a principle that the community needs to be willing. It says it must have an understanding of the project and how likely it is to be impacted and must demonstrate that it's willing. That's their words. And yet we've heard quite a few points from the other speakers and myself about how many questions remain. There are lots of ethical frameworks about how to think about willingness, but I'll talk about a little bit of research. There's been very little research done on this academically. I had a student do research on this question a few years ago. When you, as non-experts, are quite rightly being asked about this project, how do you understand the justice and the ethical issues at hand, and how do you understand your role vis-a-vis the rest of the country, the rest of the nuclear plants, the operating plants into the future, if your decision is going to mean there is or isn't a nuclear waste facility in the future? And some of the questions that arise from those who write papers on this and who sometimes do expert reports for CELA's clients at hearings are things like, will there be stigma? What will it do to the reputation of your community on agricultural products, on tourism? On the other hand, is there more favorability because the phrase was nuclear oasis or nuclear culture, a community that's used to having operating nuclear plants and therefore doesn't really think about the hazard in the same way as it might have without those facilities? Are there disproportionate impacts on certain communities? Is there coercion? Should there be compensation for living next to a radioactive waste site? And if so, what is the rationale for that? And is there social acceptance? What's the community's perspective of that? So I'll finish with a few slides on how important it is to participate. Environmental justice includes fundamentally a right to participate. And this is something we're constantly fighting for in environmental law in Canada. It comes along and then it starts to be pulled backward and we have to fight for it again. Even this process, with all the ways it's changed over the last decade and a half, is an example of that. Similarly, right to know and the non-transparency that really infuses all kinds of hazardous sectors in this country. But why participate? Well, it enhances the democratic legitimacy of decision-making. We had a comment a few minutes ago about accountability. I agree there's very poor accountability right now. That is a really important question. The local community can communicate its values, its concerns, and local knowledge through participation, and it leads to better outcomes one way or the other. So, just to sum up what I've been saying, how do you define the affected public? Are the people being consulted the ones who would be most impacted? Are Indigenous and treaty rights being respected? Is everybody being consulted? Who's benefiting and who's bearing the cost? And who's making the decision? Which community? So that's it.
Thank you, Theresa. I've got a couple questions here. One is willing participation. What is the percentage of the population voting that needs to be in favor of this proceeding? I think this is actually kind of the willing host question. How many have to vote the binding? Are you able to answer that?
I don't know if I can, because I don't know if it's been spelled out in the host agreement or not, which Brennain might be able to answer.
Maybe I can help then. I think it's 50, for it to be a binding decision, 50% plus one need to vote. And then whatever the majority is of that decision is binding. If it's less than 50% plus one vote, whatever the result of the voting is, it's not binding. And then the South Bruce Council has indicated they'll make a decision in the absence of that.
And as a generalization, the NWMO, through the whole process, has never defined its perception of adequate process and has left that very amorphous.
Another question here, I'm wondering if you can answer this too, Theresa. Is anyone looking into a use for the waste, considering that the energy level remaining in the fuel rods, etc.? So,
who spoke about this earlier? Gordon maybe did? Yeah. So we've been doing a lot of work on nuclear waste policy in Canada over the last several years. All of us on this panel have been part of that. And we have asked the government to ban reprocessing nuclear waste, used nuclear fuel. Unfortunately, the nuclear waste policy did not explicitly ban doing so, but our reason for saying so is because of concerns over non-proliferation. The minute you start making the plutonium more accessible, it's more available to terrorism and weapons direction, regardless of the intent of the original body that did the reprocessing. And Dr. Ramana, who many of you might know, who just wrote a great book, just published, called Nuclear is Not the Answer, has a really, really, really good discussion about the linkage between weapons and power.
thank you, Theresa. Okay, in just a moment, I'm going to invite Bill Knoll up to make closing comments. Whoops, I shouldn't fool around with the equipment. But I want to say two brief things, just in terms of announcements. Bill's going to come up and make some closing comments, then we're going to have dinner, and while we're having dinner, we're going to be accompanied by the Huron Harp School, who are here at the front. Let's welcome the Huron Harp School. I go to lots of meetings like this, and I'm always reminded of something that Einstein said. I believe Einstein said, I think Einstein said, genius is the ability to concentrate for 45 minutes. You folks are like triple geniuses, so thank you for your energy and paying attention. Also, I just want to put on the spot the people who are members of Protecting Our Waterways, so they'll just stand up so we can thank them for organizing this information event. Michelle, Diane, everybody back there. Let's thank them all. And now I'm going to call Bill Knoll to the stage. And as he makes his way to the stage, I don't know if you can see this, but he's wearing fabulous red sneakers.
Well, I first of all want to thank all of you for coming. It's really quite pleasing to me to see so many faces and to be interested in learning more. You know, the NWMO tells us all the time, we've got to learn more. So they don't provide the opportunity for both sides of the discussion. And you can't learn unless you know both sides of the discussion. So thank you for coming. I want to thank the speakers who did a fantastic job. Give them a hand. And we can thank Mike here too, because he did a nice job of moderating the program. So thank you, Mike. So enough of the discussion. We're going to have a little bit of music, and there's food at the back of the hall. So enjoy yourselves, and one last message. Please get out and vote. Talk to your neighbors, your contacts, your friends. There's signs back there. Take them and make sure that we have the opportunity to make a good decision here in South Bruce. But don't renege from voting. It's a democratic right. You've got to insist that you use it. Thank you a lot.
And can I add one final plug? We, the Nuclear Free North and Protect Our Waterways, have a petition to the federal government, and it's over on the sign, on the table close to the sign. So if you haven't signed it yet, it's the same one we've had out since May. So if you haven't signed it yet, please do that before or after dinner. Thanks.
Thank you,
That was great to see you.